labdien, un paldies par jūsu ielūgumu.
Did you understand it?
Esmu Maija Eikosaari no Somijas. Es runāju ļoti maz latviešu. Stop. Having said this, I will let our translators do their job and start talking about collections management policy. There are three things we are talking about. It's about the policy, about collections management, and then a checklist. And I forgot my device here while the director was introducing me, so I'm not sure if he already gave half of my presentation. Hopefully not. So, after the initial introductions, I will give a little bit of the bigger picture about the policies. We talk about terminology, documentation in museums in general, and why it is necessary to have good documentation. And then the major part of the talk will be about the checklist of the museum, the collections management policy for museums. I will tell you what is the checklist and how to write a policy. So you will be very skilled when you leave from here. I hope so. So, if I understood correctly, I was already introduced and he told most about these things. Oh, you didn't? You didn't. So, presently I'm working on my PhD thesis in Tampere University of Technology. Because after working 20 years in museums, I understood that museology doesn't give answers to all the practical problems. So I'm going to engineers to get some help. The research topic is about the information cultural institutions create, how they use it and how they reuse it. But that's about my PhD, it's a little bit of a different thing. I've been working 20 years in museums, but mainly with creating databases, prioritization plans, digitization plans, creating policies, developing processes. So a couple of years ago, one of my colleagues told me, Maija, you have been working 20 years in museums and you have never worked a museum job. So that's why I like to gather the museum professionals around me when I work. Here are my colleagues, Sari Jantunen and Leena Raaskoski from Luusto, the first museum in Finland. Sari is the dark-haired one and Leena has long blonde hair. They are collections curator with educational conservation and education and secondary education. And Leena is a long-time collections manager, intendant of the museum collections. We work closely together to create the checklist for writing the museum collections management policy. And it was created within a project with 5 very different museums. There were a large city museum, there were 2 very small private museums, there was a forest museum which has a national responsibility in their own field, and then there was a Finnish labor museum. Colleagues helped us a lot, and eventually we had about 20 Finnish museums testing and commenting on the initial versions of the checklist. Now I would like to know who you are. I will ask you 4 easy questions and you answer by saying yes, you raise your hands. So how many of you work in museums? Thank you. And in libraries, how many library people? Okay. 2. And archives. How many work in archives? Okay, thank you. And anybody in this kind of combination institutions like museum, library, Good. Because this collections policy checklist is written museums in mind, But I hope that also people working in archives and libraries get some ideas from this. And then, by the way, if you have any questions during my talk, make some movement or hold a question from there, and I will try to accommodate it as well as possible. When I first asked my colleagues what to talk to you about, they said, talk about terminology, 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 and tell how important it is. So, we begin with some words. I checked the Latvian Museum of Law in English, and Latvian certainly it has the same text, and it already defines some useful terms for you. And I noticed that the Promotional Society of Museology has done some terminology work. They have defined, I think there's collections management and collections policy, this kind of words, to give some scope how they are used. Policies in general are for a long time planning. They set out like the whole big picture what the museum is about. Strategies are more practical for shorter term, and they define how to reach the goals. And then you have action plans, which are normally written for 1 year. These words are all familiar to you, but when you start writing something, be consistent what you talk about. Then I have noticed that when we talk about work, we talk about processes and procedures and manuals and everything, we have very different concepts what they are. These are very simple definitions. Check Wikipedia for maybe better ones. And in museums, when you work, you do work in process. You have the process for object entering your museum. You have the process of documenting it and digitizing it. But it's seldom written down very clearly. At least in my museum, you didn't find it for a long time. So the information, the knowledge was passed by tradition. There were all the colleagues who introduced you. This is the way we normally do in our museum. But I strongly recommend to describe these processes, write them down, or make fancy pictures, document. Because when you have new people, it's so much easier. Read this, and you know everything. Or at least they will be able to help you, hopefully, faster. It's not that you didn't have a fantastic system. I was really impressed yesterday to see how well, for example, the warehouses were managed. And then one thing to remember when we talk about museum documentation is that it always has the element of research. It's not just that you take a glance and you categorize it and you enter the information. There is a lot of work to be done before that. This is some general statements of the collections management policy, what it should contain. And this maps where it fits into the picture. I heard that in Latvia you are required to write 3 policies when you ask for the accreditation. Was it research, education?
Communication.
Ah, okay, communication. Ooh, we are missing communication policy on the map. I get it. But now we are concentrating on collections management. I didn't come here to talk about communication. So about the checklist. I'll show you how it looks like. It's a little bit dark. This is available in the internet in English, Finnish, and Portuguese, multiple languages. And I will give you the link to the document if you want to download it for yourself and take a look at it. And in this presentation, I won't start reading it for you because you can read yourself. I'm sure at least you can use Google Translate if you don't have a professional one here. But I will show you some basic ideas how we have been structuring it and how it will be useful for you. It's not a big document. It's about 14 pages, and this second half, another 14 pages, is the terminology definitions. So why did we make it this short? The reason is that we wanted to have something very easy for people to have. When they start the process, they don't have to read hundreds of pages. I was asked, well, we have Spectrum. Maybe you know the Collections Trust in Britain has created a fantastic resource for museum collection management. They have project descriptions and big charts and a lot of instructions. But when I printed part 1 for myself, it was 400 pages. So if you have to get done something quickly, you don't want to start by reading 400 pages, no matter how good it is. So we say this is quick and dirty way to get started. So what are the benefits? Why should I use some sort of checklist or common framework to write my policy? We have been talking about collaboration here all the time, and that's the point. When you have some common understanding, when you discuss with your colleagues, when you communicate with them, when you have thought about your own processes and mapped them out, and they have done the same, it's a little bit like having a dictionary or finding a common language. It is like Anna-Kaisa said in her presentation, that when we know about our collections, it's easier for us to cooperate. When we know how we work with our collections, it's easier to move or change or plan projects, or for example, plan for these common warehouses for museums. And also having a nice written document, it is something that you can show your stakeholders, owners of the museum, the directors, administrators. It will help you to communicate your work. However, one point on that, often the policy is written for internal use, which is a larger one, goes into more detail, and then you have the public version, because probably your administrator or city mayor or somebody, he won't read even 14 pages. And I'm sure your document is going to be a little bit longer. I'm not sure how well you see the picture, but this is how we started working on it. We were trying to think of all the elements of museum work. We started on the icon definition of museums. Right in the middle, in the flower, there is the museum mission. And then there are the acquisitions and the collections care and the education, exhibition, and all those. So now I'm presenting you just the titles from the index. It suggests you what you can write in your museum collections management policy. This is not only about collecting, but it's all aspects, the whole big process of collections management. But first we want you to state why your museum is existing. We also present it in this form, because we thought that, okay, some people like seeing a chronological order and clear list. But if you want to divide the work, what we hope you are doing, sharing it with your colleagues, then this is much easier. It doesn't give you much hierarchy. When we worked this in one museum, we made huge tablecloths with these mind map drawings, We put them in the middle of a big table, people around it, and said, who wants to do what? And they came. I'm into strategy. Somebody was into the mission. And that's their work, how they were starting to work on. Also, the mind maps are included in the document you can download. And this is probably the part which is most often thought of. Actually, this is collections policy. This is the collections and acquisition part, which is where you define what your museum is collecting. And actually, I told you that I'm not going to read you from the document, but just to give you an example what kind of questions we pose or what kind of suggestions we give, I read a small part of collecting and accession, areas and emphases of collections. What themes, object types, geographic areas, or historical periods are particular focuses of the museum's collection work? List specific focuses if the museum gives priority to certain objects and areas in its collecting activities. Where necessary, also describe changes in collecting focus during the history of the museum. So this is just an example how we approach the thing. This is why it is called a checklist. It tries to remind you of things, what to go through when you are working with your policies. And if you leave something out, that's absolutely okay. But at least you have thought about the thing. You haven't forgotten it. It's a conscious choice that you don't write about something. And that's the mind map of collecting and accessioning. The third part is how to administer and manage your collections. And this part, you, for example, decide how you arrange your collections, organize, how you classify them. If you do a value classification, if you have any system, how you deaccession them. That's the second arm from the below on the right-hand side. Oops. Collections care is one of the necessary things. And when you write these policies, you also have to keep in your mind how many people you have working on it. So that's why in many of the sections we remind you, think about the resources with which you are working at the moment. You have 3 full-time conservators and 7 technicians, or 1 half-time curator. So, of course, then your policy will look very different. And the last but not least is the accessibility and use of collections, what we have been touching today a lot. Who can come and see our collections? What can they do with the collections? Are we putting our collections on the internet? Are we doing 3D scans with the collection objects and printing them 3D? Is it allowed to use the collections object or their reproductions for commercial purposes? Do we loan our objects? What kind of conditions and agreements you have to do? What kind of procedures relate to loaning objects? Do we let, for example, amateurs come and take a physical look at the collections? I have heard about these new big projects in developing the common storages. We have few of those in process, some completed in Finland, and some of the museums are now big on having open collections, open warehouses. It's not that anybody can just walk in and start looking and touching the objects. But the museum storages are now made to accommodate visitor groups, students and researchers. And it's very different to host like 20, 30-person groups in a warehouse, and photographer studios and conserving rooms than just having a storage. So these things cause quite interesting practical questions in planning. So remember to tell the architects well ahead of time what you are planning on doing in your warehouse, because they often have in their mind that it's only about storage. So that said, there is the list of things you can consider in this part. Well, I went through the paper in very orderly, bam, bam, bam. However, this is the order of the finished work. It is not something that, it's a list of contents, but when you start working on the project, you approach it very differently. Think about when you do research and you write an article about it. You don't start your thing by writing the abstract and the introduction. No, you do a lot of work first in different orders, and then you go back and do something else again. And only when you have an idea of the whole, then you start packaging it together and check, okay, maybe that order is good for me, and I will swap that and that, what they suggest, and so on. And it's also important to look at it from your particular point of view. This is worked with Finnish museums which operate in Finnish environment under Finnish law, and your environment might be very different. Something is maybe missing, or something is far too much for you. So don't worry, you leave it out, but you have been considering. And then naturally, don't take ready-made process pictures. Really think how your organization works before you either draw the pictures, or you can also describe them by word if you want. And then I showed you the mind maps. So each museum can choose where they start and where they end. This is something that should be reevaluated about every 5 years, at least check if something has changed. So don't worry if it's not perfect and if it's not complete the first time you write it. But it is important to get started with it. So here are some main points of my preaching. When you start writing it, make it yours. That was the other important thing in addition to the terminology. And you need to make decisions before and during the project. So what are the things you need the most? Start from them, maybe. How much time? Because this can take a lot of time if you involve a lot of people. I have seen and been in a project that managed to get an update for a collections management policy in half a year, 6 months. But some bigger museums, especially in the situation where the institutes are getting together, several new museums working together, and they are making a common policy, it can easily take up to 2 years. But don't be scared. We are in a museum field. This is not about anybody's life. And you just accept it. Things take time. And here, use the contents to plan your writing. And write with your colleagues. Make this common. Because if you have to agree on common ways of doing things, you do have to spend time with people and listen to them. Often people have been working in the same organization for 5 or 10 years, even kind of in the same department. And then when they start talking about their work, you notice that they don't really know what their colleague is doing. What kind of things I do that make his work difficult. And if he would have just told me, I could have changed. So that's one of the points here too. Use everybody's expertise. And don't write it alone. Often this is given to a director or manager or somebody, or you are responsible for the collections management policy. And that's a really awful task. One person can't do it really well. And when you write it, consider a little bit if there are some measurements or metrics, what kind of things you could use to convince that you are doing a good job, you succeed, and so on. For example, our conservators are working with 10 objects this month, every month. Or if it is that we are documenting so and so many objects. It was wonderful, the story Mara told about 25 objects a week. Was it right? Yes. Yeah. Well, always quantitative things are a little bit difficult, but think if there is something you can measure your success for. So, when you get started, collect everything that exists already. Why should you do the same thing twice? Of course, you have to look at them with a critical eye, but still, term definitions, there are museum plans, city strategies. If you're a city museum or state museum, you have to, in a way, play on the same game. Your strategies can't be completely different than your background organizations. So check a little bit. Also, if other museums have good-looking policies, why don't you check them out too? And then one of the issues Hanna-Kaisa also wrote up in her talk is about mapping your collection. Get an idea what you have right now and what part of it would be developed, how can it be used, and so on. Make it concrete. And remember to look at the present situation and be realistic. I'm not saying that you couldn't set yourself goals and even write strategies how to get into those goals. But if you have 3 people working in the museum and 50,000 objects, be careful what you promise and what kind of workload you are making yourself. Do you know what is low-hanging fruit?
Easy to reach.
Yes, it's something easy to reach. So that's always a good thing to start. See if, if you have, for example, a collection map already, okay, fantastic. Like, big part of your job is done. Or if something can be, with a little bit of research and completion, be integrated to the policy. Go for that first, and it looks much and feels much better. But also, you know your organizations. There are people with very sensitive feet. There are sore points in organizations. There might be some things between the departments or such. So think about them too. And here again, a few words about the terminology. My friend said it's so important, and I agree too, and we have been talking about that here on the corridors. But make sure that the words are something that fits your mouth, we say in Finland. Don't take too complicated or too strange terms to use. And this is also a good time to introduce some new concepts. Sometimes you have been doing something, but you don't really have a good word for it. And there are some suggestions. If you read our terminology list, I found some nice ones like retrospective and proactive documentation. I'll let you look them up. So, what are you supposed to do if everything doesn't work so nicely? if you wouldn't really like to go out with the leaking roofs and the floods and the mold, like my Danish colleague here came out from the closet and said, this is our reality. We argue that you should still write it down, because if you let the situation go on like that, undocumented, it's very difficult to change it. You might have a colleague who is a pain, or who does things wrong, but of course you don't write in the policy that my colleague does everything wrong. But when you document the way this person works or wants you to work, maybe when you look at it on the paper together and start discussing about it, people understand that, maybe we should do these things in a different order, or maybe you would need some help doing this job. So this is not about being nasty to anybody, but it's bringing these issues to discussion. And the common challenge is, we work with people. So there are problems with people, schism between rivalry between departments, between museums, unclear responsibilities. I'm sure this is not an unknown list for you. But there are ways of meeting the challenges. Talking, communication is an important thing. And then you need to do some work with your superiors. Get them behind you. Argue them the benefits. Find like-minded people. It's much nicer to work in a group. We were talking about the low-hanging fruit and being aware of the sore toes of the people. Here is a list for you how you can start convincing your boss and your colleagues. I will send these slides to Iveta, and she will distribute them to all of you, so you don't have to write down. And I assume also Hannakai's slides will be available. You can stop taking notes now, when I'm almost at the end. But we have noticed that sometimes... Oh, sorry, I was too fast. We have noticed that people who don't work in a museum sometimes have no understanding what is happening behind the scenes. I was once sitting in the boardroom discussing the enterprise architecture of the city of Tampere, education and cultural services. And then there was one person who, after my long speech, said, "But how many people do you have in the museum?" I thought there's only some guy selling the tickets. So, you know, exhibitions, boom. There we go. We have the guy who sells the tickets. So this makes your work visible. It helps you communicate with the politicians and bureaucrats. We have documented our processes. Please, read here. Briefly, a couple of real-life examples of near disasters. This happened in a large city which had several museums who were given a task to write a common collections management policy. They had very good and able project manager, but there was a disagreement on words. The art museum people just could not stand when they said we have to make a value classification. It was a complete no, no, no. And they came together once a month, and it was stuck for several months, the work, they just couldn't get over this. The project manager remembered significance. I think, was it somebody mentioned it, was it Iveta? It's an Australian method of thinking about the importance of an object. And she said, don't we all talk about significance? And boom! That was it. You didn't need to do anything else but change a word. And the work started going on. They were agreeing on what it meant for everybody, and it didn't feel bad. And the second case, during the last 2 minutes, is about how unclear decision-making and difficult history of rivalry between two departments had made people work in very funny ways. The processes were not supporting each other just because 20 years ago some bosses hadn't agreed with each other. Things were made more difficult than they needed to be. And these people needed to work together and create a common policy. We would have needed to start from the beginning, the acquisitions and collecting, and who makes decision about and how to make decision about taking objects in your collection. But we just couldn't. Because if we would have started on that point, it would have made a war. It would have started a war between these two departments. So we had to think about something which would create positive energy to the project. And as a start, we made a huge collection mapping where everybody could give their expertise. People started talking to each other, making friends, so to say. And after a few months, also the difficult issues could start discussed in a friendly manner. This is the conclusion of the points I have made here. So nothing new in these points. Focus on your point of view, consider your stakeholders, use your colleagues also, cooperate, prepare, plan and write. You need to make decisions together and take it to your administration to be accepted. So, this is what it should be resulting. Thank you.